But the heart doesn't have to be told, it just does it by itself. And we're gonna talk about everything you ever wanted to know about a heartbeat. Which only lasts about 0.8 seconds, but boy, there's a lot that goes on. And so let's get going here. Okay, typical cadaver picture, and we learned in lab about the aorta, and the pulmonary trunk is the most anterior feature of the heart. These three vessels coming out of the aorta are the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery. As we said, the heart is a double pump. It pumps into two circulatory systems. One circulatory system is called the pulmonary circuit, and basically arteries carry blood away from the heart, and arteries ultimately get smaller and smaller and smaller, and the smallest arteries are called arterioles, and they in turn lead into capillary beds, which is where fuel, nutrients, and oxygen are dispersed to all the cells of the body, and waste products are picked up and carried back, and the blood comes out the other side of a capillary bed into a vein, and which comes back to the heart. Okay? In this case, in the pulmonary circuit, the artery that goes away from the heart is shown in blue because it carries deoxygenated blood. The blood is oxygenated in the lungs, and so one of those rare cases where a vein is shown in red because it carries oxygenated blood back to the heart. And then the heart pumps, the left side of the heart pumps into the systemic circuit, which goes where? Everywhere. Okay, and so where are the capillaries? Everywhere. There are thousands and thousands of miles of them, and they're very small vessels, about 9 micrometers in diameter. A blood cell is 7. And so the blood cells are pumped single file through all these capillaries, which are everywhere. And the cells of the body are interspersed with interstitial fluid, and fuel, nutrients, and oxygen diffuse out of the capillaries into the interstitial fluid in a way that we've described superficially, and that we will now look at in great detail. So the systemic circuit is everywhere. Takes a lot of pressure to pump this blood out everywhere in the body, so the left side of the heart is a very powerful pump. And the blood is pumped out everywhere and returns back and into little veins called venules, which anastomose to form ever larger veins. And finally, the largest vein of all is the vena cava, which returns the blood to the right side of the heart. Okay, and the various layers of tissue, we have the membrane, which is surrounding the heart, and just outside the heart we have another membrane, which is really considered to be part of the pericardium. And then the most strategic part of the heart is myo, means muscle. This is the heart muscle that we'll talk about. And the inner lining is the endocardium, which is a single cell layer of tissue which lines the entire cardiovascular system. It's very smooth, sometimes called the endothelium, and even the smallest capillary consists almost solely of a layer of endothelium made of simple squamous epithelium, the thinnest membrane of the body. So from the inside of the heart out to all the vessels of the body, made out of simple squamous epithelium. The pericardium protects adjacent organs from getting beaten to death by the sort of vigorous activity exhibited by the heart. And it secretes a lubricating fluid typical of serous membranes. And there are two layers. The inner layer, sometimes called the epicardium, which is really hardly by anybody though, And we have the visceral pericardium adhering to the heart and the parietal pericardium. And the two of them sort of form a pocket which contains this lubricating fluid. Here we have the myocardium, the heart muscle that we'll talk all about, and then this single cell layer of tissue comprised of simple squamous epithelium. Okay, so the pericardium secretes a lubricating fluid, typical of serous membranes. Okay, we'll run into membranes of this type all over the place. Okay, epicardium is really the parietal pericardium. Actually, it's the visceral pericardium, yeah. Okay, right there. So there's the parietal pericardium. The myocardium is the heart muscle, which exhibits autorhythmicity. Okay. And the endocardium, that lines all of the blood vessels, and as it lines the blood vessels, it's called endothelium. It's really the same tissue. Its surface is very smooth. Why do you think their surface is so smooth? To
prevent friction?
To prevent blood clots. Okay? Remember, platelets don't like to run into rough surfaces. Okay, they'll initiate the clotting process. So we have 4 chambers, okay, in the heart. A pair of atria, which are receiving chambers, which have very thin walls and lack very much musculature at all, and the pumping chambers, which are the ventricles. The right side receives blood from all over the body and pumps it to the lungs. The left side receives blood from the lungs and pumps it out to all of the body. Okay? And all the heart can do is contract, so both pumps are doing exactly the same thing at the same time. It's just that the right side pumps under much lower pressure. Okay? Part of it is because the walls are much thinner, and part of it is because this tricuspid valve between the right atrium and right ventricle leaks on purpose a little bit. Okay? And whereas on the left-hand side, we have very thick, powerful muscular walls, and this bicuspid or mitral valve doesn't leak at all. If it does, you are considered to have a serious heart problem. They call it heart murmur. And so we have these thick fibrous structures called chordae tendineae, which prevent these valves from turning inside out, from inverting. Okay? And so as the heart muscle contracts, these papillary muscles also get shorter, and they pull on these little chordae tendineae, preventing the valves from inverting. Okay? So this set of valves between the atria and the ventricles is called the atrioventricular valves, or the AV valves, and this is where you find the chordae tendineae. Notice that the cusps of the AV valves are pointing downward. So as the ventricles contract, that pushes the blood up against the cusps of those valves, forcing them shut. Okay? That's what causes the AV valves to snap shut, giving rise to heart sound 1. So when the heart is contracting, the AV valves are shut. Notice that the semilunar valves, on the other hand, have cusps that are pointing up. Okay? And so when the heart contracts, they are forced open. The blood, which is being pushed by the ventricles upwards, forces those cusps open, and those semilunar valves open into the arteries. And so that's just what we want to happen. The blood forces those valves open and flows out into the arteries, in the cardiac ejection phase of the cardiac cycle. Okay? So when the heart is contracting, the AV valves are shut and the semilunar valves are open. When the heart relaxes, the blood that just got pumped out into the arteries wants to flow back into the heart, and that forces the cusps of those semilunar valves back down, and they close. And the purpose of valves in any pumping system is to prevent the liquid from flowing back where it just came from, so that it will be forced to flow to a new place. Okay? The valves in any pumping system force the liquid that's being pumped into one-way flow. So, okay, these AV valves prevent the blood from flowing back into the atria where it just came from. And these semilunar valves, when they snap shut, prevent the blood that was just pumped out into the arteries from flowing back into the heart. So when the heart contracts, it gives rise to this lubbed up sound. The first sound, called heart sound 1, is the AV valve snapping shut. When the heart contracts, the second sound, which is a slightly lighter sound, is the semilunar valve snapping shut. So if you can visualize what's happening in that lubbed up action, you pretty much visualize what's going on with a heartbeat. Yeah.
Why does the one side is okay if it leaks?
Because we want to have lower pressure in this side, okay? And because we don't want to pump the blood to the lungs under high pressure, it'll damage them.
Oh, okay.
Takes a lot of pressure to force the blood out into the body all over the place. But we typically the blood pressure in the pulmonary system is about 15 millimeters of mercury, whereas it's as opposed to 120/80 that we find on the other side. So the left side is a very high pressure system. The right side is a low pressure system. And it's unusual if this valve doesn't leak a little bit. Doesn't leak a lot, but it leaks a little bit. So the atria are the receiving chambers. Blood is constantly returning to the heart, and you gotta have a place for it to come into while the ventricles are busy pumping. The blood's coming back all the time, whether the ventricles are pumping or not, okay? So you gotta have a place for it to come to, so that when the AV valves open, the atria have been filling, and when those AV valves open, when the heart relaxes, the blood that has filled up the atria immediately falls into the ventricles and is ready to be pumped out. The ventricles are the muscular pumping chambers of the heart. Okay, and so, I always have these questions that ask you the order, in what, I give you a series of chambers and ask you in what order does the blood flow through these chambers? And so the answer would be right atrium, right ventricle, and then lungs, and then left atrium and left ventricle. Okay. So we have two sets of valves. The AV valves prevent the blood from flowing backwards from the ventricles into the atria, the receiving chambers. The semilunar valves prevent blood from flowing backwards from the major arteries back into the heart. You want to pump the blood out into the arteries and have it stay there. When the heart pumps blood out into the arteries, they exhibit elasticity, okay? And so they sort of swell up, and that exerts pressure on the blood. That keeps your blood pressure up while the heart is relaxing. And that same pressure would force the blood back into the heart if the pulmonary valves didn't snap shut, okay? So here we have a picture of the heart that shows the semilunar valves are both shut and the AV valves are both open. And this, I was just gonna ask you, is the heart relaxed or contracted? But here it says right there. So when the heart's relaxed, these valves are open, AV valves are open, and blood is falling from the atria into the ventricles. Okay, and there you see what an AV valve looks like, and you'll see it when you do your heart dissection. All of it. These valves are surrounded by this fibrous tissue called the chordae tendineae, which actually serves to hold them open nicely when the heart is relaxed. So the AV valves are open. The AV valves are the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve. When the ventricles contract, the AV valve snaps shut, giving rise to heart sound 1, and for a brief instant, all 4 valves are closed. But as the ventricles squeeze on the blood, since water is an incompressible fluid, it pushes mightily against these semilunar valves, whose cusps are pointing upward, and forces them open. And the blood is forced out into the arteries in the cardiac ejection phase, the pumping phase. Heart sound 1 comes from the AV valve snapping shut. Which of the following gives rise to heart sound 1? I give you a list of things, and you pick AV valve snapping shut.
And they snap shut at the exact same time?
Yep. Because the heart contracts as a whole. Okay. Both sides of the heart are doing the same thing at the same time. Okay. And the left AV valve is called the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve, and either one's fine. But you should probably should know them both. And this is the high pressure valve that you don't want to leak at all. Okay, chordae tendineae prevent the AV valve from inverting. There's a nice picture from the inside of a ventricle showing the chordae tendineae and papillary muscles, both of which are lab words. When the heart is relaxed, the AV valves are open, and blood has just been forced out into the artery and has snapped these semilunar valves shut. This is the aortic semilunar valve. Excuse me, this is the pulmonary semilunar valve. And remember that the pulmonary trunk is the most anterior feature of the heart. And just behind it is the root of the aorta, in which you find the aortic semilunar valve. So when the ventricles relax, the semilunar valves close. The semilunar valves prevent blood from flowing back into the ventricles. Okay. Heart sound 2 comes from the semilunar valve snapping shut. They are of lighter construction, so heart sound 2 isn't quite as loud as heart sound 1. So we have lubbed up, lubbed up, lubbed up, like that. Okay. So here we have the pumping phase, the cardiac ejection phase, AV valves shut, semilunar valves open. Blood being pumped to the lungs and out to the entire body. Here, the top of the heart has been removed so you can look down into the semilunar valves, whose cusps are clearly pointing upwards towards you. Here we have the top of the heart, we see all 4. We have the 2 AV valves, which are of heavier construction, and the 2 semilunar valves. This is the anterior side of the heart. So which one of these 2 is the pulmonary semilunar valve? That one?
That one.
Yeah.
This one, because remember we said the pulmonary trunk is the most anterior feature on the heart. There's one style of artificial valve. So you see the left ventricle is of much heavier construction, giving rise to the heavier pressures on the left side.
Do they use pig valves sometimes
Uh,
in replacement?
I honestly don't know, but I would think there might be a problem with rejection.
Yeah.
So,
Actually, I was told my grandfather had.
A pig valve?
yeah,
I thought they used them for a little while, at least.
yeah. I think I've heard of that, but you'd be fighting the rejection issue. So, coronary vessels, and we're learning these in lab, important anatomy. The heart beats itself first. So the first vessels to come off the aorta are the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. The right coronary artery gives rise to the marginal artery, and then it goes around the backside of the heart and gives rise to the posterior interventricular artery. The left coronary artery bifurcates into the circumflex coronary artery and the anterior interventricular artery, which you always see coming right down the front of the heart. A visible feature on all hearts. Okay, the veins, we don't worry so much about the nomenclature. There is a sort of widened area just before the blood. Of course, the veins, the coronary veins return the blood to the right atrium because all the blood from all over the body is returned to the right atrium from the various veins. So this coronary sinus feeds into the right atrium. Here's a person with a stenotic artery. This is when the heart is pumping and the pressure's up, it sort of opens it up, but then when the heart relaxes, it closes. Pretty soon, it'll stay closed, and that person won't be a happy camper. And this is an angiogram. When they send you in for an angiogram, they put a catheter in your femoral artery in your groin and thread it all the way up around the aortic arch. And thread it in either, they have a little tip that's designed to either go in the left coronary artery or the right coronary artery. And they follow it with fluoroscopy. And I've seen the catheters, and that's one of the things cardiologists do. Cardiologists, most of them are not highly enthusiastic about giving angiograms because they're kind of risky procedures. Talk about highly invasive. And the heart doesn't like having big things put into it, and sometimes, you have to be defibrillated as a result. Whenever they give you a procedure like that, they usually give you a drug called Versed, which is an amnesiac, and so you don't remember having to be defibrillated, which is quite commonplace. One of the risky things with angiograms is knocking off a piece of plaque, which then will lodge in the lung or the brain.
So there's a chance of death from that?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
oh yeah, yeah, big time. Okay, and so, used to be what they do is blow up a balloon in a process called angioplasty. I've seen the little balloons. They inflate these to 300 pounds per square inch. The balloon is, you can't even see it in the catheter until it's inflated. But then, of course, you run the risk of the artery collapsing again when you pull the catheter back out. In these catheters, they have a guide wire, and very often they'll leave the guide wire in and pull the catheter back around it, leaving the guide wire in place so they can feed another catheter back up, and so they won't have to go through the grueling ordeal of getting the catheter just where they want it, because you leave the guide wire in there. So you can feed the next catheter in where and know it's gonna go exactly where the first one was. And so they have guide wires inside these things. Okay, what they do now, that's met with a great deal of success, is they'll insert a stent in the artery that holds it open. And this is widely, this is done very commonly, a life-saving procedure, and people can go on to live another 20, 30 years when they've been close to death as a result of these things. The stent is inserted, wrapped around, very tightly coiled around the catheter, and they put the balloon inside the stent, so when they inflate the balloon, it blows up, you know, it makes the stent bigger, and then they deflate the balloon. That's how they make the spring big enough to stay in there. Very often when an artery is stenotic, which means it's narrowed by atherosclerosis, you should know what stenosis means. When it's stenotic, it will become tortuous. Stenotic artery that is full of plaque is not a happy artery. And so very often they'll become all tortuous and everything, and you can't get a catheter in there. And that's when you cannot then insert a stent, and that patient then is a candidate for a CABG, a coronary artery bypass graft. And they usually they'll put stents. It's a lot easier to put a stent in than it is to do a CABG on somebody. So coronary artery bypass graft, you have to have a pretty healthy patient. A lot of times, because this is so invasive, they have to cut the rib cage open, and used to be they'd have to stop the heart and put you on a heart-lung machine, but they've been working on procedures where they don't have to stop the heart. And so, I keep seeing this hand sticking up over there, and I think someone's raising their hand. Just out of the corner of my eye. I have really good peripheral vision.
Do you want me to move it so it looks like
Unfortunately.
it's at the back of the classroom?
Pardon?
Do you want me to move it so it looks
Oh,
like it's at
no,
the back
that's
of the
fine.
classroom?
Now that I know it's there, now if someone does have a question, they're gonna get ignored. So, sometime back, one thing they were working on was called an octopus, where they spread the chest wall and they put suction devices around the part of the heart they wanna work on. So the rest of the heart just beats away like crazy, but they can hold this one part stationary. I wouldn't think that'd make the heart feel very good, but probably better than stopping it. So here's the suction devices, and here's the artery that they're working on. And so they put the graft, you can see the blocked artery, they've isolated this heart tissue, and with suction, huge amount of pressure holds it still while they're working on it. Suturing a new artery in place there, either from your mammary artery or your ulnar artery or one of those. If all of your arteries are stenotic, you're kind of a poor candidate for a CABG. So you should know the order of cardiac blood flow, okay? And so we have the vena cava goes into the right atrium, right ventricle through the tricuspid valve, then up through the pulmonary trunk in the pulmonary semilunar valve, and pulmonary trunk bifurcates into the pulmonary arteries, go to the lungs, come back in the pulmonary veins, which comes to the left atrium, left ventricle, aorta, and there it is. Okay, and here's an axial view showing the ascending aorta, which is larger than the descending aorta, because remember we have those three vessels coming out the top, and quite a bit of blood is flowing out to the arms and head out through those, and so the descending aorta is visibly smaller. This is a great big tumor that's kind of messing things up. Okay, here's this sagittal series that we looked at in lab that I love to ask questions out of. We're coming from left to right in sagittal slices of about 1 centimeter apart. You see how thick the walls of the left ventricle are, okay? And as we move to the right 1 centimeter, we start to see papillary muscles. There, still left ventricle getting smaller. Okay, now we're just starting to see a little bit of interventricular septum and a little bit of pulmonary trunk. You can see how anterior that pulmonary trunk is. Here you have right ventricle and pulmonary trunk, still a little bit of left ventricle and interventricular septum. Here is right ventricle, pulmonary trunk. This is right atrium. Okay. And it's very seldom you can see all 4 chambers of the heart in one slice. It's the only reason I showed this. Okay, this is an echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound, and you can watch. We had an echocardiography class where I was before, a whole quarter class, and I sat in on it, and you could watch a heartbeat in real time. And there's left ventricle and aortic semilunar valve. You could watch the cusps of the valve flapping, just looked like they were flapping in the wind, and as blood ran through, and so into the aorta. Typical congenital defects, the most common is the ventricular septal defect. And there is a fetal shunt that all fetuses have, that we'll talk about next quarter. That is an opening in the interventricular septum that every fetus has, and sometimes it doesn't close, about 1 in every 500 births. A really nasty one is where the great vessels are transposed, and so the pulmonary trunk is hooked onto the left ventricle, and the aorta is hooked onto the right ventricle. Think of the havoc that would wreak. Another one is where, with a severely narrowed aorta, called coarctation of the aorta. Those are the most common ones. I just happen to have a picture where this is a coarctation of the aorta. And just a slight narrowing of the aorta like that greatly reduces the amount of blood that can flow through it. Okay. Properties of cardiac muscles. Okay, so we're gonna look at what happens. Remember we said that when we talked about